Alright everybody, welcome to this week's edition of the Leadership Blend with your host Ricardo D. Rice, and we are in episode 11. So again, we're rolling right along. In the last couple of weeks, I went over a lot of business geared stuff, and I haven't really tackled a lot of leadership things or as it pertains to your parishioners or your followers. So today, that's what we're going to do today. Today, we're going to look at the different types of generations. Yes, I know we hear that term a lot. So there are generations X, Y, baby boomers, millennials, Generation Z. What does this mean to your organization? I'm going to tell you that on today. So we're going to take a closer look at the generations and how they will affect the inner workings of your organization. And yes, this also goes for churches and ministry, because when you talk about a generation, you're talking about pretty much a nation of people who were born under the same times in the same year, which means a lot of them have the same attributes amongst them all. So when we use the term baby boomers, those are typically people who were born between 1946 and 1964. And these are people who have survived probably World War II, the Great Depression, and they're actually the largest generation in American history. Now, as we move on into millennials, we're also discovering that millennials have actually become one of the biggest groups in history as well. So when we talk about baby boomers, many of them grew up in traditional parental settings, and the father was the sole provider. Mothers were considered the housewives. This is something you want to take in mind, because when it comes to baby boomers, particularly in ministry, they're going to be a lot more family oriented, and they're going to be a lot more male heavy, because a lot of them grew up in homes that were more traditional. So the fathers were typically the ones that went out and brought home the bacon, and the mothers were typically the ones who did not work, but they were caregivers. So they took care of the kids. They may or may not have brought the groceries. They made sure the kids got to school. The fathers spent most of the day working. So their ideology works like that. So for instance, baby boomers are typically sometimes your senior pastors, or sometimes they're your deacons. So they're typically a lot more family oriented. They'll be the ones that will have a talk with the younger fathers, or they'll be the ones that want to do more family geared stuff in your ministry. Attributes. So typically for baby boomers, they're quite resourceful and they're opportunistic. They have a need for individuality and desire to challenge authority. Their persona, which has led to civil unrest and sparked movements. They are continual learners and have a thirst for knowledge. So that's something you also want to think about as well. Most of them are from that generation where they were initiating change. They were the ones that were doing sit-ins. They were the ones that were doing the civil rights movements. So you want to keep this in mind. They may be the ones that are a little rebellious about things changing in your ministry. And I always think about the youth ministry and like the male chorus. Because half the time your male chorus is evolved of older gentlemen. So when it comes to changing up things and changing the music, the deacon boards and your male choruses are typically the ones that will give you the most grief, because they're typically baby boomers. So they don't like a lot of change. And if it is going to be a change, you have to make sure they understand what that change is. So these are the kind of things you want to keep in mind when you're dealing with baby boomers. And when it comes to their jobs, they value jobs and they have a strong work ethic. They are considered loyal and competitive. They are willing to make career sacrifices and value hard work. They are team-oriented and value work ethic. They prefer maintaining company policies versus challenging procedures. So again, this is where you get into the boards, who you put on your board. You want to be mindful if you put baby boomers on your board, because they don't like change. So typically whatever has worked for 30 years, that's what they're going to want to stick to. They're not going to want to change things. They're not going to want to rouse up feathers or anything. So you definitely want to make sure when we're talking about boards that you make a good combination of baby boomers and maybe Generation X, Generation Y, because they kind of balance each other. I always tell people to be mindful of having a board that has millennials and baby boomers on it, because they're typically complete opposites when it comes to doing things and how they do them. So you definitely want to keep that in mind, particularly with dealing with baby boomers. So again, they're born between 1946 and 1964. Okay? The next group, Generation X. This is the group that was born between 1965 and 1981. And they are the generation that was birthed after baby boomers and the new economy, and they were in the new economy. They were ushered in on the heels of the Cold War, the AIDS epidemic, and organizational scandal. They were parented by baby boomers and raised by mass media and technology. So typically Generation X came around, we're talking about 1981. So they came around right when technology was kind of peaking its head, but definitely not at its peak, and definitely not, the internet wasn't booming or anything. But they came in at a time when technology was peering its head. So they're mindful a lot more of technology, but not on the scale that millennials are. So I always go back to millennials because they are the biggest group now. So always think about when you think about technology, that's typically your millennial age, but Generation X and Generation Y are not completely against technology. It's just not their strong suit. So continuing on with Generation X, they seek to retain balance in both their professional and personal lives. They have little company loyalty and a particular untrust for companies. This is due to organizational scandals that they have witnessed, and they are motivated to achieve and believe in risk-taking. So with your Generation X, they'll take small risks, but they're not going to take extreme risks. Because remember, they were raised by baby boomers. So baby boomers don't believe in taking risks. They believe in sticking to what has worked and riding it out. So Generation X is slightly deviated from that, but not a whole lot. So when it comes to being in their workplace, this generation was the first to witness both parents working, and as a result, they acquired an independence and adaptability mindset. They believe in work hard, play hard, encouraging balance in both arenas. The witnessing of parents losing their jobs in a bad economy prompted this generation to discard company loyalty. They retain a loyalty to co-workers and bosses versus the actual organization. Alright, so you want to keep that in mind. They'll be loyal to the people that are in your organization. So this is where you find people who will be loyal to the pastor, but not necessarily to the church itself. Or they'll be loyal to an auxiliary, but again, not necessarily dedicated to the church itself. So they're kind of in it for the work, not necessarily the organization. So you definitely want to keep that in mind when you're working with Generation X, that you want to make sure they're in an organization that they are auxiliary, or they're under somebody they enjoy working for or working in. Because if not, you're probably not going to retain them because they're not used to having a lot of company loyalty. Alright, and they also don't believe in doing a lot of risk taking, just slight risk taking. And they also believe in work hard, play hard. So this is a generation that's not going to stay in church for 5 days a week. You may get them 1.5, maybe 2, but they're probably not going to stay in church 5 days a week like baby boomers would have done or used to do because they believe in having balance. So this is a generation that'll be like, okay, well I can't come to this because I have to work. Or this will be a generation that says, I have to work so I can't come to this. Whereas with your baby boomers, they'll be like, okay, well, work comes second because I'm dedicated to the ministry. So I'll be here. I'll move heaven and earth to be here. So these are the kind of things you want to think about when you're dealing with baby boomers and Generation X. Alright, so we just previously talked about the baby boomers and we talked about Generation X. So for a quick recap, remember that baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964. Now there's a reason I make references to some of the more significant things that happened in that time period. Doesn't mean they lived through it, but they felt the traces of it. So when I said baby boomers and I said they survived World War II and Great Depression, that's for emphasis purposes to give you an idea of the time period they were living in. So when you think about the Great Depression, you think about a scarcity of resources and people really having to learn how to be resourceful to get what they need to survive. So it goes to the mentality. When you think about baby boomers, think about people who were trying to scrape up whatever they could to survive. So that's the mentality they have. They're very stick to it. They're very, this is what I need. They're very, this is how it is. This is how it's supposed to be. And the same thing with Generation X. So when I was saying they came on the heels of the Cold War, organizational scandals. So the fact that they saw organizations having scandals, it kind of put a bad taste in their mouth for being loyal to organizations. Because they saw a lot of their parents get laid off from these organizations that they had devoted most of their lives to, most of their livelihood to, and then they saw them get laid off. This is really when you start seeing the transition of the loss of company loyalty, because this is when people stop getting cactuses. Because at one time when you got laid off, they gave you a cactus or a nice gold watch, you had a pension and everything, and then you start seeing this stuff slowly chip away around Generation X's time. So their ideology of organizational loyalty starts to fade. Alright? So now we get into Generation Y. And Generation Y is born between 1977 and 1997. And I always laugh because 1997 is the year I graduated from high school. And the thought of the fact that people just were born in 97 is kind of funny to me. But I digress. Alright, so history. With Generation Y, they are particularly heavy in technology. Their world was shaped by 9/11 terrorist attacks, the Persian Gulf War, natural disasters, and the introduction of the internet. This generation was born to older parents and maintains a sense of civic duty. Between the baby boomers and Generation X, they have adapted a blended view. Generation Y witnessed overworked and underappreciated grandparents, and as a result, they side with Generation X in a view and a lack of corporate loyalty. They desire flexible working schedules and accommodations of their technologies. Alright, so this particular group is the group that came along around that 9/11 scenario. So, they're seeing the Twin Towers go down. They're seeing the Persian Gulf War going on. They're experiencing natural disasters. And this is when the internet was actually introduced. So this is when you're thinking about flip phones and you being able to access the internet on your flip phone and seeing the little arrows saying that it's connecting. So they witnessed all of that. Attributes. So Generation Y desires tolerance in the workplace. They like to utilize a positive can-do ideology. They place high level of trust in authority and welcome team working experiences. They prefer group tasks, and their tech savvy has spawned a group mentality. The contention is that this generation benefits mostly from mentorships and relationships. They enjoy building connections not only with co-workers, but leadership as well. So again, Generation Y has like this blended view when it comes to organizations. So they welcome mentorships, they welcome relationships. They're all about interpersonal relationships, being able to know who the leader is, being able to understand who they report to. These are the kinds of things you want to keep in mind when you're dealing with Generation Y. They actually have a sense of civic duty, which means they're happy to be sold out to work in your ministry. They're happy to do the work of the ministry. They don't mind trying to balance work and being in ministry. So they have that blended view. So they're not as rigid as the baby boomers, and they have a little more laxity versus the Generation X. So they kind of fall right in between. Generation Y is actually the generation I look to whenever I have a board of baby boomers and Generation X, because they tend to be a little far to the right. Not as far as millennials, but a little farther to the right. All right? And lastly, the millennials, which if you've seen the pictures from my Facebook, I'm surrounded by a whole room of them, so they're all looking at me kind of evil. But it's okay, because I'm going to represent them well. All right, so the Millennial Group was born between 1982 and 2000s. Outside of baby boomers, this is the fastest growing group, which I said before. They value education, they are highly confident, they multitask, and they are self-sustaining. They have benefited from the knowledge of the previous 3 generations and were also accommodated by them. Generation Y and Generation X maintain balance to ensure that this generation would appreciate family values. Similar to Generation Y, they are tech savvy and are masters of social media. They encourage group activities and have a strong desire to fulfill civic duty. So again, this is pretty much the technology age. They actually believe in doing the Facebooks and doing the Instagrams, and they're pretty good at this stuff. Does not mean they're the be-all, end-all of social media, but they were raised on social media, so they have a better ideology of doing it, which kind of works in their favor and it works against them. Because what you find is a lot of them won't do the older social media. So they're typically not into Facebook. You really have to talk them into LinkedIn. They don't mind Instagram. They kind of like Twitter, and they actually have gotten into Snapchat. Not my thing, but they kind of like Snapchat. But when it comes to Facebook, a lot of millennials will not do Facebook because they feel like it's the old version of social media. So you want to keep that in mind. And I'm getting head nods, I must be right. So you want to keep that in mind when you're working with the young people, your youth departments. These are the kind of things you want to keep in mind when you're working with the people in your ministry, because these different types of generation have different attributes and they respond differently to different types of authorization or different types of leadership, which is probably going to be in the next segment. We'll take a look at the type of leaderships that each generation responds to. So you definitely want to keep that in mind, that when dealing with the millennials, yes, they understand social media, yes, they may be good at it, but be mindful of the types of social media they are accustomed to working with, because it can either make or break your organization. Primarily Facebook. I would not necessarily task a millennial with doing Facebook. Facebook is probably more of a Generation Y, maybe Generation X social media outlet. So keep that in mind when you're dealing with all these generations. So in the last 2 segments, we went over the 4 different types of generations. So for a quick recap, we have the baby boomers who are born between 1946 and 1964. We have Generation X, which is born between 1965 and 1981. And then we have Generation Y, which is born between 1977 and 1997. And then we have the Millennials, which are born between 1982 and the 2000s. So what does all this mean to your organization? I'm going to simplify all of this information really quickly. Okay, so when we talk about the baby boomers, the words you want to remember when you're interacting with them is individuality, resourceful, opportunistic, hard workers, strong work ethic. So you want to keep this in mind whenever you're delegating tasks. So let's say you have one of your deacons who happens to be 50 or 60. You want to keep in mind that whatever task you give him, it has to be something that's going to force him to be resourceful and something that's going to allow him to show his individuality. So you want to keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that baby boomers are very team oriented, so they don't mind doing projects that everybody has to be in on. That is important because there are other generations that do not like teamwork. I don't believe my generation likes teamwork. I personally don't like teamwork. It's not my thing. I'll do it, but I'm not very good at it because I'm more individualistic. I like to do things on my own. I don't have to necessarily be with a team. So you want to keep that in mind. Also with baby boomers, when it comes to a leadership style, they're into transactional leadership. What does that mean? Transactional leadership means exactly kind of what the name implies. Transactions. So they only want the basics. What is it going to take to get the job done? Don't give me the extras. I don't want to know all of that. What do you need from me to get this particular job done? So they're very cut and dry like that. So they respond very well to transactional leadership. So you just learned a new word today. Transactional leadership. Meaning they believe in the transaction of completing a task to get something accomplished or getting something done. All right? Generation X, you want to keep in mind independent, adaptability, work hard, play hard, discard company loyalty. So when you're delegating tasks to Generation X, you want to keep in mind that they prefer to work alone. This is Generation X. They prefer to work alone and they avoid teamwork. So if you have some people that are in that age group, 65 to 81, be mindful of how you delegate them. Do not give them a lot of group chores. They're not going to be good at it because it's not something they particularly like to do. Now remember, in your congregations, you're probably going to have all four of these, as well as Generation Z, which I did not get into. But you're going to have all four of these major generations in your congregation. It behooves you to be more mindful of how you put them together when you get them to do tasks. Because again, some of them like teamwork, some of them don't like teamwork. Some of them like transformational leadership, some like transactional leadership. So that's why I'm running over this. It's kind of something you want to keep in the back of your head when you're talking, interacting with your congregation or your people. So with Generation X, they respond better to transformational leadership. Again, when I talk about these leadership styles, a lot of times at the core of the word, it tells you what it is. So when you say transformational leadership, it's the ideology of being transformed by what the leadership that you're under. So it's kind of the ideology, especially with churches, that by interacting, giving you the word, giving you tidbits of what God expects you to do, that it transforms you to be your better self. So that's kind of what the ideology behind transformational leadership is. The ideology that doing what we do or leading you in this particular manner transform you into becoming your better self. So Generation X prefer to be under transformational leadership. And typically they seek balance. They're more loyal to bosses and co-workers, and they both lead and follow. So Generation X will lead and they will follow. So I kind of have those kind of attributes myself. Sometimes I can lead, but I don't mind following as long as it's a good leader. So you want to keep that in mind. All right, Generation Y. When you think about them, they have the can-do ideology. So nothing's off limits. They believe anything can be done and they put their mind to it. They have a high level of trust and authority, and they believe in establishing connections. So these are the kind of people you want to put on like your community outreach board, or the people who do more business to business type stuff when they're trying to get sponsorship and advertisers, because they believe in building relationships. They have a group mentality. They actually prefer, this is another group that prefers group tasks. So you can lump Generation Y and baby boomers together because both of them don't mind working in teams. Now, Generation Y and the Millennials prefer situational leadership, which means, once again, the base word situation, that you lead according to the situation, that there's no one set way to lead this particular group. If the situation calls for transformational leadership, then you give them transformational leadership. If it calls for transformational or transactional leadership, then you give them transactional leadership. So remember, Generation Y and Millennials both operate off situational leadership. Now, extra information about Generation Y is they are high maintenance. They want immediate feedback and attention. They're great multitaskers, and they welcome mentorships and relationships. So you want to think about that when you're dealing with Generation Y, that these are the people who you want to put in charge of a mentorship program. Or you may want to put them in charge of relationship building, teaching people how to build proper relationships. And lastly, the Millennials. Millennials, they value education. They're self-sustaining, multitaskers, tech-savvy, and masters of social media. They also respond well to situational leadership, meaning give me what I need for the situation. Don't give me transactional when I need transformational. Don't give me transformational when I need transactional. So you want to lead them according to the situation. They also encourage group interactions. So they don't mind getting into a little group, a little hub, and knocking out a challenge or knocking out whatever you give them. And some extra information about them is they expect open communication. This is not the generation that you give them some of it. You have to give them everything so they can properly execute a task. They have close relationships with their supervisors and they like parameters set for them. So you want to keep that in mind with millennials, that you have to be open and honest with them. Unlike baby boomers. Baby boomers goes back to transactional leadership. Give me what I need to complete my task. I don't need all the extras. Millennials are the opposite. Give me all the details. I don't care if you feel like I don't need it at all. Give me all the details so that I can execute the task properly. So as you can see, every generation kind of has its own little niches and its own attributes. And the more you know about them, the easier it is to work with them, especially in a combined workspace or a combined congregation where you have so many different types of generations. And the problem with now is, at one time, baby boomers were kind of retiring and kind of going in to do what they need to do. With this one, not so much. Now the baby boomers are having to stick around because they're living longer, they're having to work longer. A lot of them didn't expect to live as long as they have. So now you're having workplaces and congregations fill up with all four generations, and it's almost like speaking in tongues, trying to decipher who you're talking to, what needs to be said, how it's relayed. So knowing this kind of information comes in very handy for you to be able to communicate effectively with the different generations that are operating in your ministries or in your organizations. So really quickly recap: baby boomers 46 to 64, Generation X 65 to 81, Generation Y 77 to 97, Millennials 82 to 2000. And remember, each one operates off a different style of leadership. Baby boomers is transactional, Generation X is transformational, and Generation Y and Millennials both respond to situational leadership. So we've been over the different generations. Like I said, today's show is all about making sure that your people have what they need to be successful. And I always make sure I include ministry and churches because you're not exempt. And I hope by now you understand that the dynamics of an organization, particularly a nonprofit organization, also includes churches and ministries because you guys operate under the same ideology. So that's the goal of today's show. First, we went over the generations to give you an idea of how people think, especially within a combined group, which is a generation. So we went over the baby boomers, X, Y, and millennials. Now I want to get into a term that people who study psychology know a lot. And I didn't think it works, but it actually does work. So everybody take out your pens and paper. Actually show up at the bottom of the screen. And we're going to get into Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And Maslow was a scientist, and he put together this pyramid that kind of gives you an idea of where people place their specific needs. Okay? So at the bottom of the pyramid, you have the psychological stuff. So this is the basic stuff that people need to be successful. And typically stuff that an organization can't give them, but in the organization, as the leaders of your organization, you want to make sure they have access to the stuff that they need. So breathing, food, water, sleep, all that good stuff, those are at the bottom of the pyramid, meaning those are the most basic things that people need to function appropriately within your organization. So some people say, well, how does that affect me? Well, you want to make sure that when you do your schedule, that you're giving people proper time to be off and get proper sleep. We've discovered that 8 hours worth of sleep should be the standard. I know it's not really your problem, but if you want your employees to be their best individuals, then you want to make sure that you're not overscheduling them or having them work ungodly hours, stuff like that. Because if you do that, you're not going to get the best out of your employees. Also, with the food and the water, how does that affect an organization? You want to make sure that your employees are getting fair pay. Well, with nonprofits, you want to make sure that your volunteers are having incentives that, although you're not giving them a paycheck, they have great incentives, such as being able to attend your programs and services, being able to benefit from your programs and services. Case in point, let's say that your church has partnered up with the Office of the Department of Urban Housing and Development, and they have access to be able to apply for Section 8. Well, maybe some of your congregation people who volunteer in that particular area will be able to benefit from, applying for Section 8. Things like that. So that's how making sure they have their most basic needs will help your organization be great. Right above that is safety. Your employees want to make sure they have security of body, they have security of employment, resources, morality, family, health, property, all that good stuff. So you want to make sure that your employees feel safe, especially in today's time when you can't go to the movies, you can't go to church, you can't go to work. Your employees want to make sure that when they walk into your buildings of your ministry or your organization, be it the job or the nonprofit, that they feel safe. And if you know that you may be in an area that is not known for being a safe area, maybe you do need to invest in having a security guard, or maybe you do need to invest in having a guard shack with somebody up there so that your employees feel like they're safe when they come into their workplace. So that's the second level. The third level is the love and belonging. So make sure they have good friendships, family, that they have partners and stuff like that. So you definitely want, and this is actually a very big one. And churches are actually really good about this, because I've noticed that churches have taken on to the friends and family events where your family gets to attend your church, and you have food in a fellowship hall, and everybody's eating chicken and macaroni, and everybody's happy, and they're fellowshipping and getting to know everybody. These things do not seem important, but they can make a world of difference amongst your employees. The biggest gripe that I have when I consult for organizations is that the company does not give them the space to include their families. So you want to do employee appreciations and allow them to bring their family members. Your church, if they're not doing friends and families, do your friends and family. Allow them to bring their churches in it so they can meet the leaders and meet the other people that they're working with on a day-to-day basis, particularly at jobs. Because the reality is most of us spend more time at our jobs than we do at home. Your co-workers see you more than your family does, if you're honest about it, especially in today's time when people are working 3 and 4 jobs just to survive. So as a company, as an organization, you want to make sure that you give them this space to appreciate their family and invite them in. All right? The next one is esteem. So self-esteem, confidence, achievement, respect of others, respect by others. This is very important. We used to joke when I call it the corporate ladder. But it's a ladder in general. The ideology that I come into this organization at this place, but if I do a good job and it's based on merit, that I will continue to achieve. And as I achieve, my esteem goes up, and as my esteem goes up, I become a better employee for the organization. So it's kind of the ladder effect. I say I come in as a volunteer, and then after about 6 months, you notice you give me the Volunteer of the Year award. And from that, my esteem gets really big. So next, I'm applying for one of the departmental head positions. And then from there, I become a VP. We hear it all the time. When you think about the Bill Gates and you think about all these other individuals, they start at the bottom and they move their way up, as long as there is a clear ladder of succession, which a lot of times we don't do. And then the last one is self-actualization, which is the top of the pyramid, and it kind of says that I come into my own, that now all my basic needs have been met, I'm a good person, I'm whole, and now I can be a great contribution to your organization or your church or your nonprofit. So you definitely want to keep all these things in mind, because as you will see if you look it up, that there's a pyramid, and that each level is a different requirement and takes an individual to get them to the next step, to get to self-actualization, which is the ultimate goal. That you will be your best self, and as a result of you being your best self, then I can be the best help to this organization and take it to its next level.